What if the most dangerous warning Prince Harry ever received didn't come from the palace, didn't come from his brother, didn't even come from his own instincts, but from someone completely outside the royal world? Someone who understood money, contracts, power, loss. But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. And what if that warning was simple, blunt, almost uncomfortable? Review the prenup. That's the line now echoing across gossip columns, online forums, and whispered conversations among royal watchers. A line allegedly spoken not by a courtier or an aristocrat, but by Rory McIlroy, a man whose career has been built on discipline, control, and protecting what he's earned. And attached to that warning, a phrase that stopped people cold. Sly Fox. Now pause for a moment. Why would an elite athlete, someone with no formal role in royal life, feel compelled to issue a warning to a prince who had spent his entire life surrounded by advisors? Why would anyone risk being misunderstood, misquoted, or labeled cruel, unless they believed something real was at stake? And more importantly, why are people talking about this now? Because timing changes everything. Because what once sounded like harmless gossip now feels, to many observers, like a missed alarm bell. Because when you rewind the tape, when you look at what Prince Harry had, what he walked away from, and what he's fighting to hold on to now, that alleged warning suddenly feels less like an insult and more like a prophecy. But let's slow down. Before we go further, we need to be very clear about something. This story is not about declaring villains or heroes. It's not about presenting rumors as facts. And it's not about pretending we know what truly happened behind closed doors. This is about patterns, perception, power, and the uncomfortable moment when love, money, and influence collide. Because whether or not those exact words were ever spoken, the idea behind them has haunted Prince Harry's story from the very beginning. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. Let's start at the beginning. Not with Meghan, not with Rory, but with Harry, the man everyone thought they understood. Prince Harry grew up surrounded by wealth, but he didn't grow up controlling it. That distinction matters more than people realize. From the outside, Harry looked like a man who had everything handed to him. Palaces, protection, privilege, a safety net that could never disappear. But inside the royal system, money doesn't work the way it does for normal people. Harry didn't negotiate contracts. He didn't manage brand deals. He didn't sit across tables from lawyers hashing out percentages and exit clauses. The institution handled that. The firm. Money came with rules, with expectations, with invisible strings. And for most of his life, Harry accepted that trade-off. Security in exchange for obedience. Structure in exchange for autonomy. Then something shifted. He met someone who came from a completely different world. A world where personal branding mattered. Where visibility was currency. Where independence wasn't just a desire, it was a survival skill. Meghan Markle didn't grow up royal. She grew up navigating Hollywood, auditions, contracts, negotiations, and self-advocacy. That doesn't make her good or bad, but it does make her different. And differences are powerful, especially when one person understands systems the other has never had to question. Ask yourself this. How many men lose leverage not because they're foolish, but because they've never been taught to protect it? How many men confuse trust with surrender? How many men believe love alone is enough to shield them from consequences? These are uncomfortable questions, but they sit at the heart of this story. Because when Prince Harry fell in love, he didn't just choose a partner. He chose a new framework for living. And frameworks have costs. Now enter the alleged warning. Rory McIlroy is not a royal insider. He's not part of palace gossip circles. He's not a tabloid fixture chasing headlines. He's a professional athlete who has watched fortunes rise and fall, sometimes overnight. Athletes understand something the royal family rarely talks about publicly. Everything can change with one decision, one contract, one misstep, one assumption that someone else has your best interests at heart. In the sports world, prenups aren't insults. They're insurance. They're not about mistrust. They're about clarity. About protecting both people when emotions run high and circumstances shift. So when reports began circulating that McIlroy allegedly urged Harry to review the prenup, people laughed it off at first. Who was he to advise a prince? But the laughter didn't last. Because the more Harry's post-royal life unfolded, the more observers began to notice something unsettling. Harry was giving up control, fast. Control over narrative. control over money, control over relationships. And in exchange, he was promised freedom. That word again, freedom. But freedom without structure can become chaos. And freedom without safeguards can become vulnerability. Let's talk about the phrase Sly Fox. It's a loaded phrase. Clever, strategic, observant. It doesn't necessarily mean malicious, but it does imply awareness. And awareness is dangerous when one party has it and the other doesn't. People who defend Meghan hear that phrase and see misogyny. People who criticize her hear it and see confirmation. But what if it's neither? What if it's simply an acknowledgement that Meghan understands leverage in ways Harry never needed to before? Understanding leverage doesn't make someone evil, but ignoring leverage can make someone exposed. And that's where this story gets uncomfortable. Because every major turning point in Harry's recent life has involved giving something up, stepping back, walking away, letting go, titles, duties, military patronages, proximity to power, and yes, financial certainty. Each step was framed as liberation. But liberation always has a price. And the question nobody asked loudly enough was, who was paying it? When Harry left the royal fold, he didn't just lose income streams. He lost insulation. The institution that once absorbed criticism, protected assets, and smoothed over mistakes was suddenly gone. Now every decision mattered. Every deal mattered. Every miscalculation mattered. And that's when people started re-examining old whispers, old warnings, old advice that once sounded intrusive, but now sounded prescient. Was Harry ever encouraged to slow down, to protect himself, to question momentum? Or was the narrative always moving too fast? Think about how quickly everything happened. Engagement, marriage, departure, media blitz, contracts, lawsuits, rebranding. That kind of speed doesn't leave room for reflection. And reflection is where protection lives. This is why the alleged McIlroy comment hit a nerve. Not because it was cruel, but because it highlighted something Harry's story keeps circling around. The idea that he may not have been prepared for the world he chose. And preparation matters more than love when consequences arrive. Now here's where things get even more interesting. Because Rory McIlroy, whether he actually said those words or not, represents a category of people Harry stopped listening to. People who had nothing to gain. People who weren't emotionally invested. People who saw risk where Harry saw destiny. Friends reportedly faded. Advisors were replaced. Long-time relationships cooled. And the louder the outside world warned him, the tighter Harry seemed to hold onto the narrative that everyone else was wrong. That's a dangerous place to be. Because when every warning feels like an attack, wisdom starts to sound like betrayal. And this isn't just about Harry. It's about a pattern we see again and again. Successful men fall in love. They accelerate. They ignore friction. They dismiss caution as negativity. And by the time they realize something is off, the cost of reversing course feels unbearable. So they keep going, and going, and going, until one day they look back and wonder when the ground shifted beneath their feet. This is why this story matters now. Not because of gossip, but because it forces a hard question. What happens when emotional decisions are made in environments that demand strategic thinking? What happens when identity replaces accountability? What happens when warnings are framed as hostility? And perhaps the most unsettling question of all, what if the most honest advice Harry ever received came from someone he barely knew? Someone with no stake in his love life, no loyalty to the palace, no agenda beyond protecting what had taken a lifetime to build. Because if that's true, then the real tragedy isn't what was said, it's what wasn't heard. And here's the part no one talks about enough. Harry didn't just marry Meghan. He married her worldview. A worldview shaped by contracts, optics, negotiation, and self-advocacy. Again, that doesn't make it wrong, but it does make it incompatible with an institution built on silence, tradition, and containment. And when those two worlds collided, someone was always going to lose ground. The question was never whether there would be fallout. The question was who would absorb it. As we move forward, we're going to examine this story layer by layer. Not to accuse, not to excuse, but to understand. Because once you strip away emotion, titles, and loyalty, you're left with dynamics. And dynamics don't lie. Up next, we need to look closely at the man who was warned. Who Harry was before Meghan, before Hollywood, before the deals, before the exits. Because until you understand Harry's relationship with money, power, and protection, You can't understand why a simple phrase like review the prenup could carry so much weight, and why ignoring it may have set everything else in motion. But what came next would quietly reshape Harry's entire relationship with wealth, and no one noticed until it was already happening. Warnings usually come from family, not from someone who has nothing to gain. That sentence might sound obvious, but in Prince Harry's case, it wasn't. The warning that allegedly came from Rory McIlroy was jarring precisely because it broke every expected pattern. Royals are trained to listen to insiders, palace aides, advisors, long-standing confidants. To hear caution from a professional athlete, someone who didn't know the subtleties of protocols, titles, or palace loyalty, was unusual. And unusual advice carries an almost gravitational weight. It makes you stop and think. Let's rewind a little. Rory McIlroy, by all accounts, is meticulous. He's disciplined, strategic, and intensely focused on the protection of his career, contracts, and reputation. In sports, fortunes are fragile. A single misstep can cost millions. A single misunderstanding can change public perception forever. That kind of mindset isn't common in royal circles, where wealth is assumed, legacy is inherited, and consequences are often cushioned by protocol. Yet, here was someone outside the royal sphere, allegedly pointing a finger at a prince and saying, "Check your position. Be careful. Protect yourself." And the phrase that followed? Sly Fox. Short, sharp, and loaded. Not an insult in the traditional sense. More of an observation. Someone clever, someone strategic, someone who knows what they're doing and isn't afraid to use it. It's easy to dismiss as trivial chatter, but language matters, especially when it signals awareness, foresight, and potential danger. Why did McIlroy allegedly feel compelled to give this warning? Some sources suggest he saw patterns, behaviors in Harry's life that echoed mistakes he'd witnessed in high-profile relationships and financial dealings. Athletes like McIlroy see people making emotional choices with tangible consequences. Love, trust, loyalty, admirable qualities. But sometimes disastrous if combined with inexperience in handling wealth, influence, and public scrutiny. Ask yourself this: how often do outsiders perceive risks that insiders miss? Often enough that historians, strategists, and even corporate boards pay attention to it. Outsiders aren't biased by emotion. They don't have preconceptions about duty, image, or romance. They see the facts and the patterns. And in this case, the pattern was clear. A prince who had never negotiated for himself, who had grown up in a system that handled money, contracts, and fallout for him, was about to navigate a world of Hollywood negotiation, branding deals, and independent contracts. And in that world, caution is not just advisable, it's critical. What's fascinating here is how the alleged comment intersects with timing. This wasn't a casual observation. It reportedly came during a moment when Harry was already feeling the tension between royal expectations and personal freedom. Meghan Markle represented opportunity, love, and a new life. But she also represented a worldview that prized negotiation, visibility, and leveraging influence, everything Harry hadn't needed to master within the palace walls. So, the warning wasn't just about money. It wasn't about Meghan personally. It was about context, strategy, and survival. And if you think about it, that's exactly what Harry was about to test himself against: navigating freedom in a world where freedom has consequences. Let's examine the psychology for a moment. Receiving advice from an outsider can feel threatening. You question their motives. You wonder why they're speaking up. And if the advice contradicts your existing narrative, especially a narrative that involves trust, love, and personal happiness, it's easy to dismiss. But the dismissal itself is dangerous. It's not just that the warning was ignored. It's that the dismissal removed a potential safety net before the real tests even began. Now let's talk about the Sly Fox aspect. In hindsight, the term takes on an eerie relevance. A sly fox isn't reckless. A sly fox observes, calculates, and acts with precision. It's not a compliment or an accusation. It's a label of capability. It implies that someone involved understands leverage, knows how to create advantage, and can act decisively when necessary. In a narrative about love, loyalty, and finances, that label signals a shift in power dynamics. Imagine hearing that as a warning. The person you're about to marry has the ability to navigate influence and protect themselves in ways you have not yet learned. Would you feel insulted, flattered, threatened, conflicted? Likely all three at once. And that conflict is exactly what drives tension in this story. But the implications go further. By allegedly issuing this warning, McIlroy, or any outsider in a similar position, was highlighting an uncomfortable reality. Prince Harry, for all his privilege, was about to enter uncharted territory. And in uncharted territory, mistakes can be costly. Emotional decisions collide with financial realities, and without preparation, the fallout can be dramatic. We should also consider the broader lesson here. People in positions of trust often ignore warnings until consequences manifest. It's not arrogance, it's human nature. We trust love, we trust familiarity, and we trust optimism. But when those instincts meet strategic calculation from the outside world, friction arises. And that friction often creates stories that dominate headlines for years. This alleged warning also raises questions about mentorship, guidance, and influence. Who advises princes today? Who do they listen to? Are the voices surrounding them honest? Or are they filtered, curated, and politically motivated? An outsider like McIlroy bypasses all of that. He speaks from observation. He speaks from experience. And in doing so, he provides a perspective few others would dare offer. The timing of this alleged warning is critical too. It didn't come after contracts were signed, after decisions were locked, or after commitments were made. It came at a pivotal moment, when choices still mattered, when leverage could still be protected, when hindsight had not yet hardened into regret. Yet, as with many warnings in history, timing alone isn't enough. What matters is perception, reception, and action. And according to accounts, this one may have been dismissed, misinterpreted, or buried under optimism. And therein lies the dramatic tension. The gap between advice given and advice received, between caution expressed and caution heeded. Now, you might be asking, why bring in Rory McIlroy at all? Why not another athlete? Why not a royal confidant or a financial advisor? Because McIlroy symbolizes something broader, the voice of rationality in a world dominated by emotion. He represents the external observer who sees what insiders miss. That's the core of why this warning resonates. It's not about fame. It's about insight. And insight, when ignored, becomes legend. The more you examine this alleged interaction, the more patterns emerge. Harry's life after marriage is filled with high-stakes decisions, media deals, foundation management, brand launches, and public narratives. Each step carries financial and emotional consequences. Each step could have benefited from the kind of caution McIlroy allegedly voiced. Think about that phrase again. Review the prenup. Simple, direct, practical. But in the context of love, duty, and identity, it becomes heavy. It implies foresight, protection, preservation. And in a world that prizes romance over contracts, it sounds almost hostile. Yet, in reality, warnings like this are not hostile. They're preventative. They're rational. They're grounded in an understanding of risk. And they force us to ask difficult questions. When do we allow emotion to override prudence? When does trust blind us to potential consequences? When do we mistake affection for preparation? As the story unfolds, the tension between love and leverage becomes more apparent. The alleged McIlroy warning is emblematic of a broader challenge Harry faces, navigating a world where emotional intelligence and strategic thinking must coexist. One without the other can lead to vulnerability. And here's the kicker. Whether or not McIlroy actually said those words, the narrative persists because it captures a truth. The truth that Harry's decisions, romantic, financial, and personal, exist in a space where guidance can be both abundant and insufficient, where love is genuine, but consequences are tangible, where warnings exist, but are sometimes ignored until too late. The alleged comment also highlights a fascinating dynamic, the role of outsiders in shaping royal narratives. Outsiders have no loyalty to institution or bloodline. They can speak freely, see clearly, and act without fear of reprisal. Their perspective is unfiltered. And for someone like Harry, whose inner circle is increasingly curated, unfiltered insight is rare. This raises an unspoken question. How often do leaders, heirs, or public figures ignore wisdom simply because it comes from unexpected places? How often does familiarity blind judgment? And when ignored, what are the consequences? Now, consider the emotional undertones. Being called a sly fox in the context of romantic and financial caution could provoke resentment, defensiveness, or even dismissal. But it could also trigger reflection, strategic thinking, or reevaluation. Which path Harry chose is part of the story that unravels over the following chapters. Because this is where patterns start to matter, where the past foreshadows the present, where a single warning can ripple through decisions, negotiations, and relationships, all without the prince ever fully recognizing its influence. And here's where we leave Chapter 1 with a cliffhanger. The alleged outsider warning has been given. The phrase "review the prenup" hangs in the air. And the sly fox label has planted seeds of perception that may never be erased. But what came next? The series of decisions, departures, and deals would set the stage for consequences that no one saw coming, and would test Harry's judgment, loyalty, and understanding of protection like never before. Harry grew up rich, but never controlling the money. It sounds simple, almost obvious. But in reality, it's a subtle distinction that defined the early life of a man the world would later watch navigate love, loss, and independence. From the outside, the young prince had everything: palaces, prestige, protection, and privileges that most people only dream about. But wealth isn't just possession. It's power, autonomy, and the ability to make choices. And in Harry's world, those elements were often absent, despite the staggering sums surrounding him. The British royal family manages finances in a way few can imagine. There are allowances, trust funds, inherited estates, and public funding through the sovereign grant. But for younger members, like Harry in his formative years, access to money was structured, monitored, and controlled. It wasn't his to command freely. He didn't negotiate, invest independently, or experience the risks of financial autonomy firsthand. Every transaction, every expenditure, and even every public appearance was filtered through the institution's lens. Mistakes weren't punished in public, but there was little room for independent experimentation. Think about that for a moment. A man surrounded by wealth, yet shielded from the practical realities of controlling it. He lived in abundance, yet he never held the reins. Privilege without control creates a particular mindset. On the one hand, there's a sense of entitlement, an expectation of comfort. On the other hand, there's a lack of real-world experience navigating contracts, negotiations, or financial strategy. That combination can be deceptively dangerous. Ask yourself, how does someone reconcile inherited wealth with personal independence? How does one prepare for life outside a protected bubble when every choice has historically been guided for them? Harry would face these questions intensely after meeting Meghan. Let's rewind further. Harry's early adulthood was a series of structured privileges disguised as personal experience. His allowance, funded by trust money, allowed him some freedom, but real autonomy was still limited. Decisions were monitored by advisors, and mistakes were often absorbed by the institution. It's not that Harry was incapable, far from it. It's that he had never been fully required to test his judgment against real stakes. Then came the first hints of public responsibility. Military service, charity work, public advocacy. These roles gave him some autonomy, but always within a safety net. He could make decisions, but the consequences were cushioned. Risk existed, but it was calculated by people whose expertise he trusted. Financial risk, however, remained largely theoretical. He wasn't negotiating billion-dollar contracts. He wasn't navigating Hollywood deals. He wasn't building personal brands from scratch. That would all come later. The difference between having money and controlling it is profound. Having money gives comfort. Controlling it gives freedom. In Harry's case, he had comfort, but true financial freedom remained untested. And when you consider the pressures that come with marriage, public visibility, and personal ambition, that distinction becomes critical. Now, let's consider perception. The public often assumed Harry was a man of unlimited means, a prince capable of anything. Privilege becomes a lens through which every decision is judged. People assume control. People assume savvy. But the reality was more nuanced. Harry had resources, yes. But he had never needed to defend them, grow them, or negotiate them independently. And that lack of experience would shape every decision that came after. When Meghan Markle entered the picture, she brought a contrasting reality. She had experience negotiating contracts, managing her image, and advocating for herself. She understood leverage, visibility, and personal branding in ways Harry had only observed secondhand. This contrast would later create tension between expectation and experience. To understand the stakes, it's important to consider the psychological impact of having wealth but not control. There's a sense of dependence, even if it isn't openly acknowledged. Decisions are often outsourced. Responsibility is shared. And while comfort exists, true confidence in decision-making may be underdeveloped. This is where external advice, like the alleged warning from Rory McIlroy, becomes meaningful. Outsiders recognize risk because they see consequences that insiders have been shielded from. Harry, despite his maturity, had been largely insulated from the kind of real-world financial stakes that would later define his post-royal life. Ask yourself, how does someone prepare for life after privilege without ever being tested in it? How does one negotiate contracts, media deals, and public exposure when the protective layers of tradition are removed? These are questions that Harry would face almost immediately after stepping away from royal expectations. To illustrate, consider the differences in decision-making environments. Within the palace, guidance is abundant, but risk is low. Outside the palace, guidance may be sparse, but risk is constant. One requires compliance and adherence to tradition. The other demands independent judgment and strategy. Transitioning from one to the other is not a simple step. It's a seismic shift. Financial literacy, negotiation skills, and contract awareness become survival tools. In Harry's early life, these skills were observed rather than practiced. He knew the principles, but hadn't yet experienced the consequences of misjudgment. And when you combine emotional stakes, marriage, family, love, with financial responsibility, the margin for error shrinks dramatically. This is where the alleged "review the prenup" warning resonates. Prenups are not about mistrust. They are about preparation. They are about acknowledging the real-world implications of love and partnership intersecting with wealth. For someone like Harry, whose life had been insulated from negotiating his own financial outcomes, such advice would have been especially significant and perhaps unsettling. Think about it. The warning was simple, practical, and grounded in protection. Yet, it also implied a need to confront realities Harry had been shielded from. That confrontation is never easy. Emotional attachment can cloud judgment. Optimism can outweigh caution. Trust can make warnings feel like attacks. And when the advice comes from an outsider, someone with no obligation or loyalty to the palace, it can feel both irrelevant and uncomfortable, even if it is crucial. Another layer to consider: perception versus reality. The public saw a prince with seemingly limitless resources. The reality was nuanced. Access to wealth did not equate to control over it. Privilege existed alongside dependency. Comfort existed alongside inexperience. And the collision of these factors would shape Harry's post-royal journey in ways that hindsight makes clear, but foresight may not have revealed at the time. So as we trace Harry's relationship with money before Meghan, a pattern emerges. Comfort without control creates blind spots. Privilege without preparation invites risk. Optimism without caution can become vulnerability. And in that gap, external warnings, even from unexpected voices, can carry disproportionate importance. By the time Meghan entered his life, Harry's financial experience was theoretical, not practical. He understood the structure of his privileges, but he had not yet navigated the autonomy required to defend, protect, and grow his own wealth independently. This distinction would become a focal point of tension, not just in financial terms, but in personal, relational, and strategic terms as well. The stakes were not abstract. They were immediate. Every contract negotiated outside the palace, every deal pursued for independence, every public exposure carried tangible consequences. The transition from royal insulation to self-directed autonomy was sudden, high stakes, and unforgiving. And that's why the outsider's warning, the one to review the prenup, looms so large in this narrative. Because in hindsight, it wasn't just advice. It was a spotlight on a critical vulnerability. It was a signal that the rules of his world were about to change, and that untested assumptions could have consequences. And yet, Human nature being what it is, warnings are often ignored, particularly when they challenge emotional certainty. And here's the crux. Financial literacy and autonomy are not just numbers on a balance sheet. They are about decision-making confidence, negotiating power, and the ability to act without regret. They intersect with love, loyalty, and identity in ways that most people rarely consider until the consequences are unavoidable. By understanding Harry's relationship with money before Meghan, we begin to see why external advice, cautionary warnings, and strategic insight, even from outsiders like Rory McIlroy, matter. They illuminate gaps in experience, knowledge, and preparedness that can profoundly influence the trajectory of someone's life. And that leads us to a cliffhanger. Harry entered a world of love, independence, and opportunity with privilege at his back, but autonomy untested. The alleged warning hung in the background, unheeded, misunderstood, or quietly dismissed. And the first real test, the collision of emotion and strategy, was closer than anyone imagined. What happened next would force Harry to confront, for the first time, what control over wealth truly meant, and whether he was prepared to defend it in a world where the rules had changed forever. Every public figure has two reputations, the one you see and the one whispered about. It's a statement that applies to Meghan Markle as much as anyone else in the global spotlight. To the public, she was a charismatic, modern, Hollywood-born princess. The kind of woman who seemed to bridge royalty and celebrity effortlessly, charming cameras and crowds alike. But behind the curated image, observers, insiders and outsiders alike, suggest a different narrative, one shaped by strategy, awareness, and deliberate positioning. Why does this matter for Harry? Because love isn't abstract. Marriage isn't a marketing campaign. And when personal relationships intersect with public perception and financial stakes, image and strategy are inseparable. Let's start with the public perception. Meghan Markle entered the royal world as an accomplished actress, advocate, and influencer. She had experience managing public scrutiny, media narratives, and branding decisions. She understood optics. She understood contracts. She understood the stakes of visibility in a world that never forgives mistakes. That kind of acumen doesn't come naturally to everyone, certainly not someone who grew up insulated by the royal institution. Now contrast that with Harry. Privileged, yes. Experienced in public life, yes. But largely shielded from negotiating his own narrative. Decisions were guided by advisors, and consequences were absorbed by the institution. Until Meghan, Harry had rarely needed to manage the interplay between personal choice and public perception on such an aggressive, high-stakes scale. This is where strategy comes in. Reports suggest that Meghan approached her life like a chessboard. Every appearance, every project, every alliance was calculated. Not coldly, not manipulatively, but deliberately. She knew that visibility carried influence, and influence carried both opportunity and risk. That kind of calculated decision-making is foreign to most romantic relationships, let alone to someone whose entire life had been structured by tradition and duty. Ask yourself, how do two worlds like this collide? One built on inherited privilege and structured autonomy, the other on self-directed strategy and brand cultivation? How do personalities negotiate love when power dynamics are unequal, not in wealth, but in awareness and approach? Publicly, Meghan's image was one of charm, sophistication, and relatability. Privately, according to observers, she was methodical, self-aware, and attuned to leverage, social, financial, and cultural. That combination can be magnetic. It can also be intimidating. And it's precisely what some believe made the alleged warning, Sly Fox, feel apt. A sly fox isn't inherently negative. It's descriptive, observant, capable. Someone who sees opportunity where others see only intention. In a relationship, such traits can foster admiration and tension. Harry may have been captivated by these qualities, but they also represented a shift in the balance of experience, insight, and power. And this brings us back to strategy versus emotion. Meghan's life before Harry was built on calculated moves. She understood contracts, negotiation, and personal branding. She operated in environments where leverage was critical and visibility could make or break an opportunity. Love and loyalty were important, but they existed alongside a recognition that personal interests must be protected. For Harry, who had grown up in a system where love and loyalty were often assumed within the framework of tradition. This represented a new paradigm. Suddenly, emotional decisions were entangled with strategic consequences. The lessons he learned inside the palace, trust, obedience, duty, did not fully prepare him for this environment. Consider the psychological dynamic. Being in love with someone who operates with strategic awareness can create a kind of cognitive dissonance. On one hand, you admire the intelligence, foresight, and decisiveness. On the other hand, it challenges your own assumptions about trust, transparency, and the pace of decision-making. For someone like Harry, who had not needed to negotiate or protect his own wealth extensively, this tension could be profound. This is why the alleged McIlroy warning is critical. It wasn't just about a contract or a prenup. It was a signal about imbalance, awareness versus inexperience, strategy versus insulation, autonomy versus inherited privilege. Ignoring it wouldn't just be a personal choice. It could have cascading consequences in finance, reputation, and emotional well-being. And yet, there's a nuance that often gets overlooked. Meghan's strategic approach is not inherently antagonistic. It's functional. It's a survival skill in highly competitive, high-visibility worlds. Hollywood operates on negotiation, visibility, and leverage. Ignoring those dynamics is naive. Understanding them, as she allegedly did, gives her agency and foresight. From an observer's perspective, Harry's relationship with Meghan can be seen as a collision of paradigms. His instincts were shaped by tradition, duty, and inherited structures. Hers were shaped by negotiation, branding, and leverage. Both operate with intention, but the rules of engagement are different. That difference, subtle as it may seem, can create tension, misalignment, and unexpected consequences. Ask yourself another question. How do you navigate love when the other person's experience exceeds your own in critical areas? How do you negotiate a relationship when strategy and emotional trust intersect at high stakes? These aren't abstract dilemmas. They are the lived experience of anyone whose personal life intersects with wealth, visibility, and influence. And here lies another layer of complexity: the media. Meghan's image was curated, both by her team and by the stories that journalists chose to amplify. The public saw a polished persona, while private behavior, strategic, careful, deliberate, remained less visible. This duality creates gaps in perception, which can feed speculation, rumor, and tension. It also frames the narrative for observers like McIlroy, who may interpret patterns differently than insiders emotionally invested in the relationship. Consider the analogy of chess. Public image is the board that everyone sees. Private strategy is the moves happening behind the scenes. To the untrained eye, a move may seem arbitrary or even reckless. But to the strategist, every move has intent, timing, and consequence. Harry, despite his experience with public life, may have been unprepared for this layer of strategic thinking in personal relationships. Now, imagine being the recipient of an external warning in this context. An outsider identifies patterns, understands leverage, and signals potential consequences. The advice can feel jarring, even threatening, because it challenges the narrative you've constructed internally about trust, love, and partnership. The warning isn't malicious. It's a recognition of difference and potential risk. And yet, for Harry, the emotional stakes were enormous. Love, family, and loyalty are powerful motivators, often outweighing strategic caution. Even when external advice is rational, internal desire can override it. That's the tension at the heart of this story. Rational caution versus emotional commitment. Another critical dimension: leverage. Meghan, according to observers, understood it implicitly. She knew how to navigate influence, contracts, and media attention. This awareness is what some describe as the Sly Fox quality, not manipulative, but highly capable. And when someone operates with that level of insight, the partner's inexperience becomes more pronounced. That's not a moral judgment. It's a structural observation about dynamics, power, and consequence. Now, layer on the complexity of public scrutiny. Every decision, every appearance, every statement is magnified. Missteps are criticized, actions are interpreted, and narratives are shaped long before context can be clarified. For Harry, Moving from a world where mistakes were cushioned to a world where they are amplified represents a seismic shift. And for Meghan, navigating that environment required deliberate calculation. This interplay between image and strategy creates tension, fascination, and, ultimately, the conditions for conflict. When insiders see patterns, but the individual is emotionally invested, warnings may go unheeded. And that's exactly what makes the alleged McIlroy warning so compelling. It's not about judgment. It's about signaling awareness of a dynamic Harry may not have fully perceived. Ask yourself, if you were in Harry's position, how would you interpret advice from someone outside your immediate circle? Would you feel insulted, concerned, curious, defensive? Human nature suggests a mix of all four, and those reactions can influence decisions in ways that echo for years. Finally, consider the broader lesson. Public image is only one layer of influence. Private strategy determines outcomes. Success in love, finance, and visibility depends on recognizing and reconciling these dimensions. When emotional trust meets strategic awareness, balance is required. Failure to acknowledge this interplay can have consequences, personal, financial, and reputational. And that brings us to the cliffhanger for this chapter. Harry was enamored with someone who operated on a different plane of awareness. A person whose strategy, foresight, and leverage were unmatched in his experience. The alleged warning had been issued, and the seeds of tension were planted. But what came next, the first real tests of trust, independence, and strategic alignment, would challenge Harry in ways he had never faced before. And the outcomes of those tests would ripple far beyond love, touching wealth, reputation, and legacy. 3 words. Simple, short, direct. Yet when whispered in the right context, they can feel like a thunderclap. Review the prenup. For most people, a prenup is a legal safeguard, a protection for both parties, a practical, almost mundane document designed to clarify financial boundaries and responsibilities. But in the world of high-profile relationships, where wealth, fame, and legacy collide, those 3 words carry an emotional weight that can be devastating. Why? Because a prenup implies anticipation of failure. It implies that the relationship might not survive the pressures of life. It signals that even love, trust, and commitment have limits when confronted with money. And for someone like Prince Harry, raised in a world of inherited privilege and institutionalized support, the concept can feel jarring, even insulting. Let's unpack why this phrase terrifies couples, especially couples in the spotlight. First, there's the emotional component. To hear someone suggest a prenup is to hear a subtle question. What if this doesn't work? It introduces doubt, fear, and the specter of betrayal. Even when spoken pragmatically, the listener interprets it through the lens of trust. For many, the notion is deeply uncomfortable. Second, there's the power dynamic. Wealth isn't neutral. For Harry, whose finances were historically managed by the institution, the concept of negotiating protections with a partner who has experience in contracts and leverage introduces a shift in agency. Suddenly, he must confront questions he's never had to face. What do I control? What am I giving up? What's at stake? And that's where the alleged warning from Rory McIlroy gains resonance. He reportedly said not just review the prenup, but added the subtext, the unspoken implication, that Harry's financial autonomy was at risk if he failed to do so. In other words, this wasn't just advice. It was a red flag about untested vulnerabilities. Consider the psychology here. Prenups are often misinterpreted as lack of trust, greed, or cynicism. But in reality, they're a form of preparation, a way to ensure clarity and fairness when life inevitably throws challenges. For someone unfamiliar with negotiating autonomy, who has lived under protective structures, the emotional response can overwhelm the logical rationale. Ask yourself, how many couples in high-stakes situations avoid this conversation entirely? How many assume love will be enough? How many dismiss preparation as unnecessary or even unromantic? The answer is almost all, and that's why these situations spiral into drama. For Harry, the stakes were magnified by public perception. The world expected him to be generous, loyal, and romantic. Discussing a prenup could be seen as cold or calculating, even if it was a reasonable act of self-protection. And the alleged advice to review the prenup wasn't just legal guidance. It was a call to consider the consequences of emotional decisions in a world where every action is scrutinized and amplified. Now, imagine the dynamics at play. On one side, Harry, with limited experience negotiating personal financial agreements, steeped in tradition and trust. On the other side, Meghan, experienced in contracts, Hollywood negotiation, and brand management. The imbalance isn't moral, it's practical. It creates tension, uncertainty, and potential conflict. And that tension is exactly what makes the phrase so frightening. Here's a surprising fact. Prenups are far more common than the public assumes, especially in marriages where at least one partner has substantial assets. But despite their prevalence, couples rarely discuss them openly. The emotional discomfort is enormous. It's not the content that terrifies, it's what the conversation represents. The potential for failure, the acknowledgement of risk, and the confrontation of inequality in experience or leverage. And yet, avoiding a prenup does not eliminate risk. It merely postpones it. For someone like Harry, whose financial future would eventually intersect with media contracts, brand deals, and post-royal ventures, lack of preparation could have long-term consequences. Ignoring practical advice in favor of optimism may feel romantic in the moment, but the fallout can be devastating. Another dimension to consider is public perception. For royals, every financial discussion is scrutinized. Every legal agreement can be interpreted as a statement about loyalty, greed, or mistrust. Introducing the idea of a prenup invites judgment, speculation, and media interpretation. It's not just a personal decision, it's a public one. And for someone already navigating the complex intersection of love, media, and legacy, that adds another layer of pressure. Now, layer in the strategic awareness factor. Meghan's background suggests she understood leverage, contracts, and negotiation. For someone with that skill set, advocating for a prenup is rational, not cynical. For someone without similar experience, like Harry, hearing that advice can feel threatening. It's a clash of experience versus innocence, preparation versus assumption. Let's be clear. Discussing a prenup is not inherently a sign of mistrust. It's a sign of realism. It acknowledges that life is unpredictable and that relationships intersect with tangible consequences. For Harry, who had been insulated from negotiating financial terms, this reality may have been uncomfortable, even alien. And that discomfort is precisely why the alleged warning carries such narrative weight. It's not about McIlroy's authority. It's about perspective, an outsider observing dynamics that insiders might ignore. The warning signals potential misalignment, risk, and vulnerability, three factors that would later play central roles in Harry's story. Consider the analogy. A prenup is like an insurance policy. You don't buy it because you expect disaster. You buy it because you recognize the potential. In high-profile relationships, ignoring that policy is not merely risky, it's reckless. And the external observer, in this case, sees the danger before it manifests. This brings us to a critical tension in Harry and Meghan's narrative: emotion versus strategy. Love encourages trust, optimism, and leap-of-faith decisions. Strategy demands caution, foresight, and contingency planning. A prenup represents that intersection, a practical tool that conflicts with emotional impulse. Navigating this intersection is never easy, particularly when public perception, personal pride, and intimate trust collide. Another key point: the timing of advice matters. The alleged warning to review the prenup came at a pivotal moment, before major life changes. Timing is critical because preparation matters most before commitments are formalized. Once the emotional momentum of engagement or marriage accelerates, cautionary advice becomes harder to accept, even when the risks are real. And that's the irony. The very thing that could have provided clarity, preparation, is often resisted precisely because it introduces tension, doubt, or perceived mistrust. Human nature favors optimism over caution. Emotional attachment often overrides rational calculation. And in high-stakes, high-visibility relationships, the consequences of ignoring practical advice are amplified. Ask yourself, how often do we ignore good advice because it feels inconvenient or uncomfortable? How often do we equate emotional discomfort with betrayal, even when the advice is rational? The answer, for Harry, appears to have been often enough. Yet, Despite the discomfort, prenups serve as protective instruments, not weapons. They formalize expectations, clarify responsibilities, and prevent disputes from escalating into public crises. In Harry's situation, where fame, scrutiny, and financial opportunity intersected, a prenup would have been more than a legal safeguard. It would have been a tool of autonomy, control, and protection. And therein lies the tension. When emotional decisions collide with strategic imperatives, the stakes are magnified. A prenup isn't just a contract. It's a symbol of preparedness. Ignoring it risks consequences far beyond the document itself. Consequences in reputation, relationships, and long-term financial stability. So as we reflect on these three words, it becomes clear why they terrify couples, especially high-profile couples. They force confrontation with uncertainty, risk, and imbalance. They challenge assumptions about trust, equality, and control. And they highlight the gap between experience and inexperience, a gap that can be costly when ignored. And that's the cliffhanger for this chapter. The advice had been whispered, the words spoken, and the implications hanging in the air. But would Harry act? Would he recognize the potential vulnerability? Or would emotional trust override caution, leaving him exposed in ways that would only become clear in the years to follow? Trust is priceless until it becomes expensive. For Prince Harry, that statement would define the early years of his post-royal life. Growing up within the palace, trust had always been structured, regulated, and, in many ways, transactional. Advisors guided him, the institution buffered him, and decisions were rarely made without oversight. Yet when he left that protective environment, trust became something much more complicated, a currency that carried enormous risk. Consider the dynamics. Within the royal fold, trust is institutional. You trust the advisors because the system protects you. You trust your family because shared legacy enforces alignment. Missteps are absorbed. Accountability exists, but it is buffered by protocol and tradition. Now remove that environment. Remove the safety net. Remove the inherited structures. Suddenly, trust becomes personal, direct, and costly. Every decision Harry made carried consequences that could no longer be softened by the institution. And this is precisely the moment where outside warnings, like the alleged McIlroy comment, become pivotal. Review the prenup, the advice suggested, was less about suspicion of his partner and more about preparing for a world where trust alone would not guarantee protection. In an environment unshielded by tradition, trust without verification can be expensive, financially, emotionally, and reputationally. Let's explore how this played out. Harry stepped into uncharted territory, navigating media contracts, brand deals, and foundation management. He entered a world where visibility was currency, relationships were leverage, and every action was magnified. For someone whose prior experience involved structured guidance and buffered consequences, the transition was seismic. The instinct to trust, ingrained from childhood and reinforced by family tradition, now intersected with scenarios requiring strategic skepticism. Here's a surprising fact. Experts in wealth management report that heirs who have not independently negotiated financial contracts often struggle the most when managing personal wealth later in life. They may understand principles in theory, but falter in execution. The combination of trust, inexperience, and emotional attachment can lead to vulnerability, and sometimes loss. For Harry, that pattern appears repeatedly in early post-royal decisions. Now, let's talk about emotional stakes. Love, loyalty, and optimism are powerful forces. They shape perception, influence judgment, and override caution. In Harry's case, emotional attachment to Meghan may have amplified his willingness to defer to trust. The challenge was balancing genuine affection with practical caution, a balance that is deceptively difficult in high-stakes, high-visibility relationships. And here's where strategy and emotional trust collide. Every contract Harry signed, every public appearance he made, every decision about independence carried dual consequences, one emotional, one practical. Ignoring either component risked cascading effects. The alleged warning about the prenup was an early signal of this duality. It highlighted potential financial and strategic consequences while emotional judgment remained dominant. Let's examine the first practical tests. Reports indicate that Harry faced negotiations around media deals, partnerships, and foundation funding almost immediately after leaving royal duties. Each decision involved weighing trust against verification, loyalty against leverage, and personal desire against strategic necessity. The lessons he had absorbed inside the palace, where trust was structured and buffered, were now insufficient. Consider a hypothetical scenario. Two parties enter a high-value agreement based primarily on personal trust. One has extensive experience negotiating contracts, the other has none. The imbalance is structural, not emotional. Without careful evaluation, the inexperienced party is vulnerable to misaligned outcomes, overlooked clauses, or unanticipated obligations. For Harry, this imbalance was compounded by fame, scrutiny, and the velocity of post-royal life. Another factor, the emotional cost of confronting caution. Accepting warnings, reviewing prenups, or negotiating contracts in a personal relationship can feel transactional, unromantic, or even distrustful. The instinct is to defer, to prioritize relationship harmony over potential risk. But the reality is stark. In high-stakes environments, deferring can lead to irreversible consequences. Trust, untempered by preparation, becomes an unrecognized liability. Ask yourself, how often do people prioritize emotional comfort over strategic foresight? The answer is almost universally too often. We romanticize faith, loyalty, and intuition, even when logic and experience suggest caution. And in Harry's case, the stakes were not abstract. They were tangible: control over financial independence, public image, and long-term reputation. Now consider leverage. Meghan Markle, according to observers, understood her own influence and the mechanisms of public narrative. This strategic awareness was a powerful asset. But it also created a dynamic in which Harry, inexperienced in negotiation, was potentially exposed. Emotional trust can magnify perceived alignment, while structural imbalances magnify potential vulnerabilities. The warning about reviewing legal protections becomes urgent in this context. Here's the paradox. The more Harry trusted, the higher the stakes. Each step into independent life required him to exercise judgment he had rarely practiced. Trust, once safe and buffered, was now personal and expensive. Decisions that were previously guided by institutional advisors were now directly tied to his understanding, foresight, and protective measures. The alleged warning wasn't just practical advice. It was an early indication of this new reality. But human nature complicates matters. Love encourages risk-taking, optimism overrides caution, and loyalty can obscure the necessity of verification. For Harry, these dynamics created a perfect storm: emotional commitment interacting with structural inexperience, all under the unrelenting gaze of public scrutiny. Every choice became a high-stakes test, and missteps carried amplified consequences. Ask yourself, how do you balance emotional trust with practical protection when the stakes are unprecedented? How do you navigate relationships, contracts, and public scrutiny simultaneously? These are the questions Harry would face repeatedly, often with immediate consequences and minimal room for error. This dynamic also illustrates a broader lesson. Wealth and privilege do not insulate you from risk when emotional and strategic stakes collide. Experience, preparation, and independent judgment are as critical as inheritance, privilege, and optimism. Ignoring these elements invites exposure, sometimes subtle, sometimes catastrophic. And yet, the human inclination is to trust. Harry's life prior to Meghan emphasized loyalty, faith in institutions, and deference to trusted advisors. These instincts, deeply ingrained, initially guided his decisions. But in a post-royal, high-stakes environment, instincts alone are insufficient. Trust without verification, optimism without preparation, and loyalty without contingency can carry costs that no inherited wealth can fully absorb. Now, here's where the narrative tension intensifies. The alleged warning, review the prenup, was a simple piece of advice, yet it encapsulated the larger challenge: navigating love, strategy, and financial independence simultaneously. Ignoring it wasn't just emotional, it was structural. It signaled an intersection of inexperience, emotional attachment, and public visibility, all factors that would later amplify consequences. The critical question becomes, did Harry recognize the implications at the time? Was he aware that trust, while essential, could also be a vulnerability? Human psychology suggests that emotional attachment often obscures risk. Optimism biases perception, and in relationships, loyalty can overshadow foresight. For Harry, these dynamics would repeatedly test his judgment, resilience, and capacity to adapt. And that brings us to the cliffhanger for this chapter. Harry had stepped into uncharted territory, emotionally, financially, and strategically. Trust was no longer buffered by tradition or institution. Warnings had been issued, advice offered, and vulnerabilities exposed. But the first real challenge, where love, strategy, and consequence collided, was about to arrive, and it would force Harry to confront the cost of trust in a world far more complex than he had ever known. You never really know someone until you see the moves they make when no one is watching. That saying has never felt more apt than in the story of Meghan Markle and her post-royal journey alongside Prince Harry. Public perception paints one picture: a glamorous, modern princess navigating royal duties and global appearances with ease. Private observation, however, reveals another layer: deliberate, calculated, and strategic behavior that some insiders describe as fox-like. Why the term Sly Fox? In this context, it's not meant as a derogatory label. It's descriptive. It captures awareness, precision, and a knack for leveraging influence when circumstances demand it. A sly fox sees opportunity, evaluates risk, and acts decisively, all while appearing effortless. This is a skill often underappreciated by those outside her immediate sphere, and one that allegedly caught Harry, despite his experience in structured privilege, by surprise. Consider the environment Meghan entered. Hollywood is a high-stakes arena where visibility, contracts, and relationships are constantly under negotiation. A single misstep can affect not only career trajectory but public perception, brand value, and personal leverage. Success requires more than charm. It requires foresight, discipline, and an ability to navigate layers of complexity. Meghan, according to observers, mastered these skills long before meeting Harry. Contrast that with Harry's upbringing. Royal privilege is buffered and guided. Decisions are often made with counsel, and mistakes rarely carry permanent consequences. Visibility is omnipresent, but the nature of scrutiny is different. Emotional trust is assumed. Structural guidance is constant.